You've been doing everything right. You tithe, you pray, you show up on Sunday. You quote the promises over your life. You declare the scriptures over your finances with everything you've got. And then Tuesday night comes around. You open your bank account. And something in your chest just tightens, because the numbers don't match the prayers. And the question you never say out loud, the one that claws at you at 2 a.m, is this: why is it working for everyone else and not for me? Simple question, devastating weight. Here's what nobody told you. The problem isn't your faith. The problem isn't your consistency. The problem isn't that God looked down, saw your neighbor, and decided to route the blessings their way instead of yours. The problem is a single Hebrew word. One word sitting in your Bible this entire time, untouched, unexplained, and completely misrepresented by the Sunday morning version of Christianity most of us were handed. A word that draws a clean, sharp line between people who walk in compounding, generational, structurally sound financial transformation, and people who spend their entire lives standing at a divine vending machine, pressing buttons, wondering why nothing drops. Today, we fix that. Welcome to Sharp Faith, where we don't water anything down. We're going to walk through 7 things Abraham understood about money that most Christians have never been taught. Every single point builds on the one before it. Stay with me through all 7. By the time we reach the end, you are not going to see your finances through a motivational lens. Not a wishful thinking lens. A covenant. A structural, legally binding, historically grounded lens that changes how you make decisions, starting this week. Let's go. Point 1. The day God signed a contract in blood while Abraham was unconscious. I'll be honest with you. The first time I really sat with Genesis chapter 15, verse 17, I almost missed it. I had read it probably a dozen times. I thought I understood it. I didn't. And I don't think most people sitting in church pews on Sunday morning understand it either. Because what looks like a poetic moment in the text is actually one of the most legally precise, structurally loaded events in all of human history. Open your Bible to Genesis chapter 15. Most people treat this chapter like a warm encouragement passage. God makes a promise. Abraham believes. We feel good about it. We close the Bible and go make lunch. That is a surface reading. And a surface reading of this chapter will... Here is what the text actually says in Genesis chapter 15, verse 17. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. If you grew up in a Western church, that sentence sounds like dramatic poetic imagery, symbolic, evocative. You picture it, you feel something, and you move on. But if you understand the ancient Near Eastern world Abraham was embedded in, the world of Mesopotamian covenant law, the world of binding treaties between kings, the world where legal agreements were confirmed through blood ritual, that verse hits completely differently. Think about it like this. Imagine you are watching a legal contract being executed. Except instead of 2 lawyers in a conference room exchanging signatures, you are watching 2 parties walk through a corridor of split animal carcasses, each one declaring in the language every witness present would understand, "If I break this, let what happened to these animals happen to me." That is not poetry. That is a courtroom. That is the most binding legal mechanism available to human civilization at that time. Here is the Hebrew you were never handed in a church bulletin. The phrase translated in English as "made a covenant" is karat brit, and karat does not mean made. It literally means to cut. You do not make a covenant in the ancient world. You cut one. You took animals, oxen, goats, birds. You split them open. You laid the halves in two parallel rows, and both parties walked through the middle. Every person watching understood what it meant. If I violate the terms of this agreement, let what happened to these animals happen to me. There was no higher oath. There was no stronger seal. This was the legal bedrock of the ancient Near Eastern world. Some people will say, that was just a cultural ritual. It doesn't mean the covenant was literally ironclad. And I get it. Cultural rituals can be dismissed as symbolic. But here is what the text actually says. And this is the twist that should rewire your theology. In Genesis chapter 15, verses 12 through 17, when the covenant ceremony is performed, Abraham is in a tardemah, a divinely induced deep sleep. This is not a nap. This is the same Hebrew word used in Genesis chapter 2, verse 21, when God caused Adam to sleep before forming Eve from his side. It is a supernaturally imposed, unconscious state. Abraham did not walk through those pieces. He could not have. Only God passed through. The smoking firepot and the blazing torch, ancient Near Eastern representations of God's holy presence, moved through that corridor of split animals, alone. Read that again. God performed a blood oath by himself, with Abraham unconscious on the ground, with zero performance requirement attached to Abraham's side of the contract. Let me cross-reference this so you see it is not an isolated theological moment. The Apostle Paul picks this up directly in Galatians chapter 3, verse 15. Brothers and sisters, let me take an example from everyday life. Just as no one can set aside or add to a human covenant that has been duly established, so it is in this case. Paul is making a legal argument using a legal term his Greco-Roman audience would recognize immediately. The covenant was established. It cannot be unilaterally modified. Not by Abraham's failure, not by yours. And here is the common misreading I need to name directly, because it is embedded in both prosperity theology and fear-based Christianity simultaneously. People assume the covenant functions like a performance contract. God delivers when you hit your spiritual metrics. Tithe enough, pray enough, behave enough. Blessings flow. Miss a payment, contract goes into default. That is not what happened in Genesis chapter 15. That is the precise opposite of what happened. God signed a contract that He alone assumed full responsibility for keeping. The covenant does not hinge on the consistency of one man from Ur. It hinges on the unchanging, unbreakable character of the one who walked through those pieces in the dark. Let that sink in. Here is your action. Tonight, before you check your phone one more time, write this sentence on paper. The covenant was signed by God, not sustained by my perfection. Put it next to your phone charger. Read it tomorrow morning before you open a single app. This is not a confession of passivity. This is a recalibration of posture. You are not approaching a God who is scoring your performance. You are standing inside a covenant that was sealed before you were born. Point 2. Why the word blessing is the most expensive misunderstanding in your vocabulary. I want to be real with you for a second. I used to pray for blessings the way some people play the lottery. I have the numbers. I had the ticket. I just needed the right Sunday. And when the numbers didn't come up, I blamed my faith. I blamed my past. I blamed whatever sin I had probably committed that week. It never once occurred to me that I was standing at the wrong machine, asking the wrong question. So let me show you the right question. And it starts with a single Hebrew word hiding in plain sight in Genesis chapter 12. How many times this week alone have you used the word blessing? How many times have you said, "I'm just waiting on my blessing," or "God is about to bless me," or "Count your blessings"? Probably hundreds of times over a lifetime. And I am not coming for the word itself. I am coming for what we have done to it, because we have taken one of the most structurally loaded terms in the Hebrew Scriptures and turned it into a passive, sentimental placeholder, and it is costing us more than we realize. Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. The Hebrew word translated bless is barak. Most people hear bless and picture something falling on them from above. Divine rain, resources appearing, doors opening. Something arriving at your doorstep because God decided today was your day. But the etymological root of barak is connected to the image of kneeling, specifically the posture of a camel lowering its body to the ground so its owner can load cargo onto its back. A camel does not kneel because it is weak. A camel kneels because it is being loaded with purpose, with weight, with a specific destination. Barak does not mean God is going to sprinkle good things on your life like confetti at a party. Barak means God is loading you with purposeful capacity to carry a mission forward. It is directional. It is functional. It is active. It moves through you, not just to you. Think about it like a battery being installed into a device that was engineered for a specific function. The charge is not the point. The output is the point. The capacity exists to enable the mission. That one shift in understanding changes the entire question you should be praying. Most Christians are asking, "God, when are you going to bless me?" The covenant question is, "God, what is the mission you have loaded me with capacity to carry? And why am I still standing in the parking lot with a full tank and no destination?" Not a recipient waiting for a package, but a commissioned carrier who has already been loaded and equipped. Not a lottery winner waiting on a payout, but an operative who has already been deployed and hasn't realized it yet. Here is your action. Open your Notes app right now. Finish this sentence. I am empowered with capacity in order to... Do not leave it blank. Do not say, "I don't know yet." Write the most honest, incomplete, imperfect answer you have. A carrier who does not know their destination is just idling in a parking lot with a full tank of gas. Start moving toward the mission. Even an imprecise step in the right direction is a step. Point 3. Abraham did not trust God with his finances. He liquidated an established life and moved before he had a confirmed destination. And honestly, this is the point that makes people the most uncomfortable. So let me just say it plainly, and then let the text do the heavy lifting. We have constructed a cultural Christianity that has rebranded hesitation as holiness. We say we are trusting God with our finances. And in practice, what that translates to is, we do not open the budget spreadsheet, we do not make the hard phone call, we do not take the risk that faith actually requires, and we label our motionlessness spiritual maturity. Abraham does not support that theology, not even close. Genesis chapter 12, verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. 5 words in English, but the Hebrew word for went is halak, halak. And this word carries a weight that flat English translation simply cannot hold. Halak, in the context of covenant relationship, does not mean to take a cautious step. It does not mean to test the waters and see how it feels. It means to walk completely, fully, without reversing direction, as an act of total covenant commitment. The same root appears in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Walk humbly with your God. And that walking is not described as tentative or conditional. It is directional. It is irreversible. It is all the way in. And this is exactly the kind of thing we unpack every week on Sharp Faith, because the texture of the original language is where the real blueprint lives, buried underneath translations that domesticate what was always meant to be. Now consider the actual logistics of what Abraham did when he halaked out of Haran. He was 75 years old. He had a fully established life, land, livestock, social structure, community roots built over decades. He did not know where he was going. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 makes that explicit. Go to the land I will show you. Future tense. Unspecified destination. No map, no financial projections for the journey, no confirmed arrival point waiting for him on the other side. He packed everything. Every family member, every servant, every animal, every piece of gold and silver accumulated over a lifetime of building. Can you imagine what his neighbors thought? Can you imagine what his own internal voice was saying the night before he left, when the tents were rolled and the animals were restless, and there was still no confirmed destination written on any map in? He did not silence that voice with certainty. He silenced it with halak, with total, irrevocable, forward-only movement. No reverse gear, no contingency plan. Just the word of a covenant God and the decision to move. That is not comfortable faith. That is structured, costly, all-in faith. And it looks very different from what most of us have been told faith looks like. Here is the question I want you to sit with honestly before we move forward. Do you currently have a direction? Because if you do, and you have been calling your motionlessness spiritual patience, it might be time to reconsider that label. Is it wisdom holding you still, or is it fear wearing wisdom's clothes? Here is your action. Identify the one financial decision you have been postponing for more than 90 days. Write it at the top of a blank page. Draw 2 columns. Label 1, this is wisdom. Label the other, this is fear wearing wisdom's clothes. Fill both columns with complete honesty. Then pray, not for the outcome, but for clarity about which column is actually driving the delay. Then put a specific date on the page, not when I feel ready, a date. Covenant movement operates on timelines, not feelings. Point 4. The tithe was never a 10% transaction. It was a declaration of which economy you're operating in. Look, I know the tithe conversation is loaded. People have been hurt by prosperity preachers who weaponized Malachi chapter 3 into a divine fundraising mechanism. I've seen it. You've seen it. So I want to acknowledge that pain up front and then ask you to set the baggage down for a moment. Because what Abraham does in Genesis chapter 14 has nothing to do with those abuses. Nothing. It predates the entire system that was later corrupted. Genesis chapter 14, verse 20. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. This is Abraham giving a tithe to Melchizedek, the king of Salem, priest of God Most High, after a military victory in which he recovered Lot and all the plunder of 4 defeated kings. Here is what most people completely miss about the timing. This happens before the law of Moses exists. Centuries before Leviticus. Centuries before any commandment was written requiring a tithe. Abraham was not following a rule. There was no rule yet. He was operating from something deeper than obligation. He was operating from covenant instinct. The Hebrew word for tithe, maaser, comes from the root eser, meaning 10. But the significance is not the arithmetic. The significance is Melchizedek himself. In the ancient Near Eastern world, Melchizedek is an extraordinary figure. A king with no recorded genealogy, a priest of the Most High God, operating entirely outside the established religious and political structures of the surrounding nations. He appears suddenly in Genesis chapter 14 and then disappears. The New Testament book of Hebrews spends significant real estate in chapters 5 through 7, arguing that Melchizedek foreshadows Jesus Christ as the ultimate high priest, existing above and before the entire Levitical system. When Abraham gave a tenth to Melchizedek, every person in that ancient world who understood the cultural and spiritual weight of that act would have recognized what was happening. Not a donation, not a membership fee, not a divine transaction designed to trigger a proportional return. A public declaration of allegiance to a higher order. Think about it like a franchise model. When a franchise owner follows the operational standards of the parent company, sourcing, pricing, branding, quality control, they are not just obeying a rule book. They are plugging into an infrastructure that was already proven before they walked through the door. They get access to a supply chain, a customer base, and a brand reputation that would take them decades to build from scratch alone. But the moment they go rogue, the moment they start sourcing their own ingredients and quietly ignoring the proven playbook, they lose the infrastructure. Not the building, the backing, the system that made the building worth anything in the first place. The tithe is your recurring signal that you are still plugged into the covenant infrastructure. Not paying a bill, not triggering a formula, maintaining the active connection to the system that was running long before you arrived and will run long after. Now, the common misreading I need to name directly. Malachi chapter 3, verse 10. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. Test me in this, is quoted constantly as a financial formula. Give 10% get, return, repeat. That is a vending machine reading of a covenant passage. The point of Malachi chapter 3 is not a transaction. It is the restoration of covenant posture to a people who had abandoned their declaration of allegiance. God was not offering a deal. He was calling His people back into the system they had walked away from. Not a payment plan, but a homecoming. Here is your action. The next time you give, this Sunday, this week, whenever it is, before you hit submit or place the envelope, say this either out loud or in your heart. This is my declaration. I am in the covenant economy. I do not operate by scarcity. I operate by the principles of the Most High. Change the internal language of the act. The behavior stays the same. The posture behind it becomes a weapon instead of a ritual. Point 5. God did not double down on Abraham because he was faithful. He doubled down because the covenant was structurally unbreakable. This next one is uncomfortable, even for me, because it requires us to look at Abraham not as a hero to admire, but as a case study in human failure, and then watch what God does in response. And what God does should completely dismantle the version of grace most of us were handed. Abraham lied twice about his wife. Genesis chapter 12. Abraham and Sarah arrive in Egypt during a famine. Abraham is afraid that the Egyptians will kill him and take Sarah because she is beautiful. So he instructs Sarah to tell them she is his sister, not his wife. Pharaoh takes Sarah into his household. Abraham profits materially from the arrangement. He receives livestock, servants, significant wealth. And his wife is sitting in another man's palace because her husband chose self-preservation over covenant integrity. This is not a minor moral wobble. This is a calculated deception that endangered his wife, compromised his integrity, and undermined the very promise God had staked on this woman's future. And then he does it again in Genesis chapter 20 with Abimelech. Same scheme, different king, same failure. Now here's the question most sermons sprint past as fast as possible. Did God retract the covenant? Genesis chapter 12, verse 17. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife, Sarai. The Hebrew word translated inflicted is naga. This is not a passive word describing natural consequences unfolding on their own timeline. Naga describes a direct, decisive, targeted act of divine intervention, the same root used elsewhere to describe the intentional hand of God moving with focused, deliberate force. God did not observe the situation and let it play out. God moved, actively, into a mess that Abraham had manufactured with his own fear, to recover the covenant asset, because Sarah was the vessel through whom the generational promise would travel into history. The covenant was not retracted because Abraham failed. The covenant was actively protected by the one who signed it, even while Abraham was in the middle of his own mess. I remember talking to a man once who told me he had made a series of financial decisions a few years earlier that he described as catastrophically stupid. His words, not mine. He had taken out loans he couldn't service, invested in something a friend recommended without doing any real research, and lost everything he had built over years of work. And then he said something I've never forgotten. He said, After that, I basically decided that God's financial promises weren't for people like me. I had blown it too badly. So I just stopped. Stopped planning. Stopped building. Stopped believing the blueprint applied to my situation. And he had been stuck in that posture for 3 years. I told him, Abraham lost his wife to Pharaoh's palace because he lied to save his own skin. And God still showed up and moved on his behalf. Not because Abraham deserved it, but because the covenant was not structured around Abraham's performance record. It was structured around the character of the God who signed it. Your worst financial decision does not have more authority over your future than the covenant God signed. No fluff, just truth. Here is your action. Write down on paper, not in a notes app, on actual paper, one financial failure from your past that you have been silently using as evidence that the covenant does not apply to you. Then write this directly beneath it. The covenant was not canceled by this. I am still an heir. Fold the paper. Keep it somewhere private. You are not pretending the failure did not happen. You are refusing to let it carry more weight than the agreement God signed in Genesis chapter 15. Point 6. The real point of the Isaac test was never about sacrifice. It was about whether Abraham had started worshiping the method instead of the maker. Genesis chapter 22 is one of the most emotionally brutal passages in the entire Bible. God instructs Abraham to take Isaac, the son he waited decades for, the child whose existence was itself a miracle, the human vessel through whom every covenant promise was supposed to travel forward through history, and sacrifice him on a mountain. Abraham obeys. He takes the wood. He takes the fire. He takes the knife. He takes his son. And as they walk up that mountain, Isaac, not yet understanding what is about to happen, asks his father, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham says, "God himself will provide the lamb." He raises the knife, and God stops him. Genesis chapter 22, verse 12. Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. The Hebrew word translated fear is yareh, yareh. In English, fear sounds like terror, like the emotion before a car accident, like the physical response to imminent danger. But yar, in the framework of covenant relationship, carries a meaning far more structurally precise than that. It means to hold something in such complete and settled reverence that it takes absolute priority, even above the specific instruments God himself has used to fulfill his own promises. Hear me carefully. Here is the internal logic of the test, and this is the step that most sermons skip completely. If Abraham's covenant faith was genuinely anchored in God, in the author, in the promise giver, then removing Isaac could not destroy the covenant, because the covenant was never located in Isaac. It was located in God. Isaac was the delivery mechanism, the vehicle, the method. But if Abraham's faith had quietly migrated, without him even fully noticing, from the God who made the promise to the specific instrument God was using to fulfill it, then removing that instrument would collapse everything Abraham had built his life around. The test was designed to reveal which one it actually was. Abraham passed, not because he felt no fear, but because decades of covenant walking had done a specific work in him. It had loosened his grip on the method and tightened his grip on the maker. That is the posture we are building toward in this video. That is what covenant maturity actually looks like in practice. Now here is how this plays out in your finances today, because this is where it gets painfully personal. You got a job and you believed it was God's provision. And it was. And then the company restructured and the position disappeared. And instead of trusting that the covenant does not hinge on that specific vehicle, you went into a spiral. Because somewhere along the way, without realizing it, you had transferred your trust from the provider to the provision. You built a business, and you were certain it was what God had called you to build. And it failed. And instead of recalibrating and moving forward in covenant confidence, you concluded that God had moved on from you, because the method you were attached to was no longer operational. Not the vehicle, but the destination. Not the job, but the one who provides. Not the investment, but the God who owns every asset in every market, in every economy on the planet. Here is your action. Look at your current financial situation. Identify one specific thing you have been treating as God's provision. A job, a client, a business, an income stream that is now disrupted or gone. Write it down. Then write this question next to it. Was I trusting God, or was I trusting this specific thing God was using? Sit with that question in prayer for 10 minutes tonight, not to get a quick resolution, to honestly locate your actual posture. Covenant people hold the method loosely and the maker tightly. Point 7. You are already inside the covenant. The only question is whether you are behaving like it. Everything we have walked through today, the blood oath God signed alone in the dark, the loaded capacity of barak, the total directional commitment of halak, the tithe as a covenant declaration of allegiance, the unbreakable promise that survived Abraham's worst failures, the Isaac test that revealed the difference between method and maker, it all lands here, in one verse, that most Christians quote without unpacking what they are actually claiming. Galatians chapter 3, verse 29. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. The Greek word translated heirs is kleronomoi, krironomi. And here is why this single word is one of the most important legal terms in the entire New Testament. In the first century Roman and Greek legal world, the exact cultural and legal framework Paul's audience lived and breathed in every single day, a kleronomos was not someone who was hoping to one day receive an inheritance if they performed well enough to qualify. A kleronomos was someone who had already been legally identified and recorded as the owner of the estate. The name was on the document. The standing was established in court. The legal status was confirmed and irrevocable. The full transfer of assets might still be unfolding over time, but the heir's identity was not in question. Paul is not writing inspirational poetry here. He is making a precise legal argument to people who lived inside a legal culture that gave those words specific, non-negotiable meaning. He is saying, your status as a covenant heir is not a future possibility you are working toward. It is a present legal reality established by what Christ accomplished. You are not auditioning for heir status. You are not accumulating enough spiritual credit to eventually qualify. According to Galatians chapter 3, verse 29, if you belong to Christ, you already are one. The covenant paperwork has your name on it. The question is not whether you have access. The question is whether you are walking through the door. Let that sink in. So here is the real question, and I want you to feel the full weight of it before this video ends. Not, does God want to bless me? That question was answered on the mountain, in Genesis chapter 15, when a blazing torch passed through split animal carcasses in the dark, alone, with Abraham unconscious on the ground. The real question is, are you living like an heir or operating like a beggar? Because those are not just two emotional states, they are two completely different operating systems, running on completely different assumptions about reality. A beggar hoards whatever they have, because they operate from the deep assumption that resources are scarce, unpredictable, and could disappear at any moment. An heir invests, gives, takes strategic risks, and builds deliberately, because they know the estate is vastly larger than their current account balance, and the covenant backing them is stronger than any market condition. A beggar makes financial decisions from the crouch of fear. An heir makes financial decisions from the upright posture of settled, legally confirmed identity. Look at every financial decision you made in the last 12 months. Every one of them. Which operating system would the data actually show you were running on? Because many of us carry heir theology in our heads and run beggar software in our daily decisions. We quote Galatians chapter 3, verse 29 on Sunday, and spend Monday through Saturday making choices that look exactly like someone who has no access, no standing, and nothing backing them up. That gap between what we say we believe and how we actually behave is precisely what today was designed to close. Yeah, I said it. And I said it because I needed someone to say it to me once. And nobody did. So here we are.
And if you want to go deeper on what it looks like practically, day by day, decision by decision, to operate as a covenant heir specifically around debt, income structure, and generational wealth building, that is exactly where we go next. But right now, let us finish strong. Here is your action. Tonight, before 10 o'clock at night, do this. Take a blank sheet of paper. Write at the top, in the largest handwriting you have, I am an heir, not a beggar. Below that, write 3 specific, observable, measurable financial behaviors you will change starting this week. Not someday, this week, based on how an heir actually operates. An heir does not avoid opening their financial statements out of shame. An heir does not refuse to make a plan because planning feels presumptuous. An heir manages the estate with deliberate intention because they know exactly who owns it and exactly who they represent. Write the 3 behaviors.
Tape that paper somewhere. You will see it every single morning. That is your covenant declaration made physical and visible. Hear me carefully. I know some of you came into this video carrying something that goes much deeper than a financial question. It is the weight of years. The weight of doing exactly what you were told to do. Tithing, praying, showing up, declaring, believing, and watching the results simply not materialize. The weight of quietly wondering whether maybe the promises apply to everyone else, but somehow not to your specific situation, your specific past, your specific collection of failures. I need you to hear this directly. Nothing in this video was designed to show you the distance between where you are and where you should be, and leave you standing in that gap feeling condemned. That is not the point. The point is to hand you the key that nobody put in your hands in the pew. You were not lazy. You were not faithless. You were operating with incomplete information inside a system you were never fully taught to understand. And the church, in far too many cases, handed you a simplified, sanitized, domesticated version of a covenant framework that was never designed to be tame. But today you heard the real architecture. Abraham was not a perfect man. He lied. He doubted. He grabbed for the steering wheel when the covenant God was navigating. He made decisions that created consequences echoing through history in ways still felt today. And the covenant held. Not because Abraham held it together, but because the one who signed it does not walk back his word. Not ever. That same covenant has your name on it. Not because you have earned it, not because you have finally arrived at some threshold of faithfulness that tips the scales in your favor, but because of what was accomplished on a cross and confirmed in an empty tomb, which made you legally, permanently, irrevocably an heir to everything promised to Abraham. This is not here to condemn you. It is here to wake you up. Here is what I want you to do before you close this video. First, grab something to write with right now. A napkin, a journal, your notes app. Write, "I am an heir, not a beggar." Then write one thing, one specific, concrete, non-vague thing that you are going to do differently this week based on what you heard today. Not a feeling, not an intention, a specific action, a specific day, a specific time. Second, drop a comment right now. Type these exact words. I choose covenant, not chance. That is your public declaration. That is you planting a flag in the ground. That is you stepping across the line from lottery thinking into covenant architecture. I want to see it in the comments. Third, if this video opened something in you, share it today. Because somebody in your world right now is lying awake at 2 in the morning asking the same question you came into this video carrying. And they need this blueprint more than they need another motivational reel. Subscribe to Sharp Faith so you never miss a blueprint drop. Stay sharp.